In this video, we are going to look at finding the amplitude and period from sine and cosine graphs. So we are going to start by graphing a sine curve. So I have the x and y table filled in for you guys. The x value are the radians. So the x value is always going to be the angle is either in degrees or radians. We're working with radians here. The y value is the coordinate from your unit circle. So just really quickly to show you guys where these numbers are coming from. So let's say I've said find the sine of 0 radians. You would go to the 0 mark on your unit circle and then take the y value since I'm looking at sine. So that would be sine of 0 radians is 0. Let's say I said find the sine of pi over 2. You would go to the pi over 2 mark on your unit circle, and again you're going to take the y value of that coordinate since this is a sine function. So that is where 1 comes from. If you notice, I chose easy numbers. I'm trying to make my life a little bit easier. I don't want to graph root 3 over 2. So that's why I chose these radians. If you wanted to use other things and graph, 1/2, you can. There's nothing wrong with that. So we are going to create the points and graph the sine curve. So my points are all graphed. Now I'm going to create the actual curve part. So you guys can see it's kind of the same pattern that's repeating. If I were to extend the graph further than the 2 pi and negative 2 pi, it would look exactly the same. And the reason it's the same is because it is a cyclic pattern. So that just means it's going to repeat that same type of cycle each time. Now that we have our graph, what I want to do is identify period and amplitude. So the period, you guys can see the definition down at the bottom of the page. It is the horizontal length of one cycle. So for the period, we're basically trying to figure out what chunk of the graph is repeating. So if I were to take part of the graph and shift it over, it should line up with the next part of the graph perfectly. So the way I like to do this is always starting at the origin, just because that's an easy place to start. So let's say I thought just this was the period, so from 0 to 1 pi. So what I would want to be able to do is pick up that chunk of the graph and move it over. So I want to pick up this point and move it. If I were to do that, that would shift this curve and it would look like this. If I look, that does not match my red curve, the red curve that I drew before, so that is not the period. So if I extend this a little bit further, this is the part of the graph that is repeating. So if I were to take up that purple line and shift it over, that shows me the cycle that is repeating each time. So I hit the origin, go up to 1, hit 0 again, go down to -1, then I go back to 0, then I would repeat that cycle. So I'd go back up to 1, then down to 0, down to -1, up to 0 again. And that whole curve would continue repeating on both sides of the graph. So that's how I can tell the period. So now I just want to figure out the actual length of that. So it starts at 0, goes all the way to 2 pi. So the period is 2 pi. Now the amplitude is a little bit different. That is the magnitude or the height of the wave. So it's the vertical height of the wave. So I'm looking at the vertical height of the wave to figure out my amplitude. So we have a kind of mini formula. So what I want to do is subtract the maximum value and the minimum value and then cut that in half or multiply by 1/2. So my highest point is at 1, my lowest point is at -1. So I have 1/2 times 1 minus a -1. So that is 1/2 times 2, which is just 1. So the vertical height of the wave is just 1. So you're subtracting the max, the highest point, and the lowest point, and then cutting that number in half. So let's take a look at one more. So here I have a cosine graph. Again, I have my table all set up for you. X is still the radians, Y those values came from the unit circle. So I'm going to go ahead and graph my cosine curve. Now that my points are drawn, I'm going to connect all of my points. Okay, so that's not very symmetrical, but this is what the general shape of a cosine curve looks like. So the one major difference between sine and cosine, if you think back or look back to my sine graph, sine went through the origin, or that 0, 0 point right in the center. Cosine did not. So that's one way you can tell from a graph right away if it is sine versus cosine. Sine goes through the origin, cosine does not. Now that I have my curve, I want to find the period and amplitude again. So the period, that is the horizontal length of one cycle. So I want to figure out what part of this pattern is repeating. And if you're having trouble seeing these graphs or picturing the rest of the graph, what you can do is go online, find one of the online websites like desmos.com, D-E-S-M-O-S. Let me put that down here. This is a great website that will actually show you an extended picture of the graph. So go ahead and use that. It is a free resource for you guys to check out. So back to the period of the graph. So I want to figure out what part is repeating. Again, I want to start at the y-axis. Sorry, guys. Starting at the y-axis, I want to figure out what part is repeating. So in cosine, it's kind of a little bit easier. So I kind of have to wait until I hit back at +1. So my graph goes down, hits 0, hits -1 down here, goes back to 0, and then goes back to 1. So at that point, it would turn around and go right back down. So my section of the graph that is repeating is from here, from 0 all the way to 2 pi again. Now, the period will not always be 2 pi. It just was a coincidence in these two graphs, but it will not always be that. We're going to look at other ones later on that are not 2 pi. So, now to the amplitude. So again, that is the vertical height of the wave. So I want to take half of the max minus the min, or highest minus lowest. So my highest point is up at +1. My lowest point is down at -1. And again, just like the period, this is not always going to be the same. Normally, it is not just this simple. So I have 1/2 times 2, which is again just 1. So the magnitude or the amplitude is just a +1. The best way to find the period and amplitude, you really just have to practice finding them on your own. Watching these videos only helps you so much. You really have to try, especially for the period, you have to try finding that on your own. So make sure you're doing any practice problems that are assigned. So we are going to go on to finding amplitude and period now from an equation. So you can see the general formats up at the top of the page. Again, we're sticking with sine and cosine equations. So the a and b values are non-zero real numbers. To find the amplitude, it is the absolute value of a. So remember absolute value, that's the distance from 0, so it's basically just making your number positive. Then the period is 2 pi over b. So make sure you guys are noticing the b is the number behind the sine and cosine function. A is the very first number, or the number in front. So let's take a look at just a couple of examples here. So I have our two equations here. So with number 1, first thing we're going to do is find the amplitude. So remember, amplitude is the a value, or the very first number. And I want to take the absolute value of it. So the absolute value of -4 is a +4. So when I graph this, that vertical length, or the amplitude, is going to be +4. Next, for the period. Once I identify the b value, which is just the 3, not the x, I want to plug that in. So we have, let's see, 2 pi over the absolute value of 3. The absolute value of 3 is just 3. That cannot be simplified any further, so the period would be 2 pi over 3. So that is the horizontal length of one cycle. Let's take a look at number 2. So in this case, with the amplitude, I don't see a number in front of the cosine, but I know it's just, I treat it kind of like a variable, where if there's no number in front, there's that invisible 1. So in this case, the amplitude is the absolute value of 1, which is just 1. Now, for the period, this one is a little bit trickier because I have a fraction, but I'm still going to solve it the same way. So I have 2 pi over the absolute value of b. B in this case is 1/4. Sorry that my screen is jumping around. So let's continue solving this. So absolute value of negative 1/4 is a positive 1/4. Now I have 2 pi divided by 1/4. So if we write this out differently, or if you think about it differently, this is the same thing as this. So I'm dividing by a fraction. So what I want to do is either keep, change, flip, or multiply by the reciprocal. As a math teacher, I prefer multiply by the reciprocal because it sounds way better. It sounds a lot more mathematical. So that's what we're going to do. So, let's change out of the highlighter. I have 2 pi, I change this to multiplication, and I flip my fraction around. Then I just multiply straight across the top, straight across the bottom if I had, an actual number down there instead of 1. So multiply straight across. I have 8 pi over 1, which is just 8 pi. So that was the period for my second equation there. So this is how to find the amplitude and period. Again, make sure you are trying the practice problems. I can't stress that enough. With this topic, you really have to just try it yourself. Watching the videos will only help you so much.